Yes, so I will try to be as brief as possible, and I would like to share the results of some what we feel as some important research work that we have been able to do in the field of rheumatology with specific reference to rheumatoid arthritis. And the title of my talk is Rheumatoid Arthritis Research Updates. So before we enter into the main content of our discussion, I'd like to just give an overview of, what is the scenario, what is our understanding in terms of rheumatoid arthritis from an Ayurvedic perspective, especially in terms of what research is actually taking place, and how is the global community looking at the contributions that Ayurveda can make in the field of rheumatoid arthritis. So now when we look at rheumatoid arthritis, I mean, there are various issues. Like, we also had a lot of difficulty in deciding what should be the title of this CME program, whether we should use an Ayurvedic disease terminology or an allopathic disease terminology. So one of the reasons why we did not use an Ayurvedic terminology was because we wanted to look at the total Indian scenario, and we wanted to be as neutral and as diplomatic as possible. If we use Amavata, then we get into trouble with one school of thought in Ayurveda. If we use Vata Rakta, then that contradicts. So there is some kind of communication that is required in the field of Ayurveda, after which we would be able to probably bring a better perspective and have more meaningful titles. For the time being, we thought that since rheumatoid arthritis is more clearly defined in terms of communication, we will use the title rheumatoid arthritis. So now there are issues, like there are various research issues when we look at rheumatoid arthritis from Ayurveda. Now here the whole question is, do we want to look at the disease as rheumatoid arthritis and then give an Ayurvedic treatment, which is definitely not the purpose of our discussions and meetings. How do we tackle this problem? I mean, how do we have a meaningful approach to diagnosing such cases? Like, when we look at research, it's not just enough to treat the patients. We need to create documented evidence and knowledge that will be with which we'll be able to communicate to a scientific audience the capabilities of what Ayurveda is able to do and what it is not able to do. So I think this question has no meaning if you're looking at yourself as only a practitioner who wants to just treat diseases. And there I think it is more important to develop a clear Ayurvedic understanding of the condition. There is not even any need to decide whether it is rheumatoid arthritis or any other condition. As most of the earlier speakers said, the nosology in Ayurveda and allopathic medicine are very different. I mean, they cannot be correlated on a one-to-one basis. The entire methodology is different. But when we come to the research problem, there is an issue, because the entire field of biomedical research in the world is dominated by modern medicine, and unless we produce data in a language that is comprehensible to the biomedical scientists, we wouldn't be able to build a case for Ayurveda. And why do we want to do this? Because although it is enough, like in our own experience, we know that if there are successful practitioners, they do get patients. But the whole issue is, if you want to upscale this, if you want to really make Ayurveda more visible at a global level, then a more serious kind of communication is required. And there, a dialogue between modern research scientists and Ayurvedic physicians or Ayurvedic scientists is also very much necessary. So diagnosis, there is this issue of how do we give an Ayurvedic understanding and then create a bridge with which we will be able to communicate with modern doctors. That is a problem that we have. And as I said, this is not for treatment. Like, we now, a nice study which we were, which I would be trying to give some, outcomes. Also, we bypass this problem by making the Ayurvedic physician independent of the allopathic physician. There was no attempt to at all communicate or correlate, because we wanted the Ayurvedic physician to have the complete freedom to assess each case based on their own criteria. So one of the areas is diagnosis. The second thing is treatment. Like, when we come to decide what is the Ayurvedic treatment that is going to be offered, and as you will see when we review some of the research works that have already taken place, there is a lot of diversity in the way Ayurvedic physicians, treat diseases. So even when it comes into the research area, there are problems. Like, you have studies which look at, single molecules, that could be isolated from herbs and their effect on rheumatoid arthritis. We have a few herbs that have come into prominence, like semicarpa. If you search PubMed, which is one of the most reputed kind of search engines for biomedical research, you will come up with plant names like Semicarpus anacardium or Boswellia serrata, or in some rare cases also Gugulu. Interestingly, Gugulu doesn't figure prominently in any of these research searches. So you find that even the treatments that are being tested in the name of Ayurveda are very varied. So this creates a lot of confusion in communicating, because when the biomedical community looks at Ayurvedic treatments that are being studied, they're kind of baffled by the diversity and complexity of the Ayurvedic treatment modalities. So there is this challenge of what do we define as a standard Ayurvedic treatment protocol, without which we cannot come into the realm of research. Again, I would like to make this distinction between practice and research. The needs for a practitioner. If our goal is only to create good practitioners who can, treat diseases, our entire methodology would be different. But here, since we want to also, generate the data and evidence that is communicable to the modern research community, we have to look at these problems. Now, the third thing is in terms of the outcome measures. Like, how do we know? I mean, this is very important when we look at it in the context of research, is how do we, in terms of research, come up with measurements which tell us what was the condition of the patient before the treatment and what it was after. Now, we do have modern parameters, but they are helpful only if you look at the disease from a modern point of view. Like once you decide that you're going to diagnose it as rheumatoid arthritis, then you do have a lot of tools and measures with which we can see how the disease progresses, what is the condition of the patient after the treatment. But if you're going to use an Ayurvedic terminology, this is one of the challenges which we faced in our study. We're still trying to work around that problem. Although we try to also develop Ayurvedic modules for evaluating outcome measures, they couldn't be satisfactorily validated. But we have understood what the problems are. We are hoping that in the future we will be able to kind of build better on it. And I think the suggestions given by Dr. Kamath are quite kind of interesting and revealing. I mean, we must go in those lines. Of course, there would be differences of opinion regarding, the terminologies that are used. But I'm quite convinced that we would need to come up with these kind of tools if we want to take Ayurveda into a research kind of, perspective. Now, if you look at, this is just a summary of what I've already said, is rheumatoid arthritis Amavata or Vata-Rakta? Now, this is one dominant question, but there are certain other sub-questions also, because if we look at who would like to look at rheumatoid arthritis as only one type of Vata-Rakta. Vata-Rakta is something much more broader, and maybe some type of Vata-Rakta would be matching with. Because Kharanada, in one of the commentaries, has mentioned that there are 75 types of Vata-Rakta. And he classifies Vatika Vata-Rakta into about 30 types. Which means that for the Sankshepa, the Acharyas have reduced it, which means so much of individual variations are possible. And today we are seeing that when actually good physicians treat these conditions, Vata-Rakta, their treatment strategies are also varying. Although there is a pattern that emerges, there is a lot of emphasis in Ayurveda on individualized modification of the treatment regimen. So this can be understood with better clarity if we bring in the Ayurvedic system of classification and give it a kind of clear, logical consistency. So what is Vata-Rakta? It could be a broad pathogenic pathway under which many diseases could be included, and rheumatoid arthritis could be just one of them. And it is also important to realize that the Amavata entity is something which came historically much later. So we have to really think as to what Vakbhada or Charaka would have thought of this disease in their times, because they didn't use the term Amavata. So we are also tempted to think that Amavata could be subsumed within the category of Vata-Rakta at a broader level. So it's also interesting to note that many of the times, even when Ayurvedic physicians treat the condition as Amavata, this is a study which is also being planned, that we do a study in which we have Ayurvedic physicians diagnosing the case both as Amavata or as Vata-Rakta. We have different groups of people, and then we do a comparison and see do a parallel allopathic diagnosis also. Unless this is done, we will not be able to resolve this problem. So what we are talking about is that this debate has started, I think many decades ago, and we have not been able to come to a proper conclusion. And there is no point in holding meetings and fighting over this. I think as Ayurvedic physicians, people of knowledge, we must be able to meet knowledge with knowledge. I mean, not with emotion or debates. So at least I think it's very important. This is one important thing which we are going to do as a part of our Center of Excellence program, is also to promote a serious dialogue between physicians from both the north and the south, the entire Indian community, and see if we can come on a common platform and speak with sense. And what we are going to offer here is, we need to have this dialogue based on actual clinical observations. Very stringent, very elaborate observations, and it would be the observations which will give the judgment. The observations in the sense, you develop the criteria for diagnosing what is Amavata, what is Vatarakta. In a blinded manner, they would also be evaluated by allopathic physicians. And we see that success that is happening, whether the diagnosis Amavada is giving a better clinical result in rheumatoid arthritis cases, or is it Vatarakta which is giving a better. So unless we do this kind of experiments, we will never be able to resolve this problem. So one of our major goals is to bring the debate from tables to actually clinics. And what it is painful to note that such a dialogue has never taken place. So it is, as long as you sit behind walls and talk to each other, I think this problem cannot be solved. So that is one aspect of the diagnosis. And then we look at the treatment. Again, you have this wide range. Ayurveda can be treated in a multifarious way today. And everybody will call it as Ayurvedic treatment. As long as he can refer it to some herb in some text, he will claim it to be Ayurvedic treatment. So even if a molecule is given, it will be labeled as Ayurveda. Right? So there is also this problem of defining, what is it that we should call as Ayurvedic treatment? What would be the essential components? There should be some logic. It is not the herb or a formulation which makes a treatment or intervention Ayurvedic. It is a thought process. Ayurveda has an approach of looking at the body which is different from Western medicine. Because if you use a herb using the logic of Western medicine, you are actually practicing allopathic medicine only. It is not Ayurvedic medicine. Whereas I don't think this should be encouraged, but if we are able to use an allopathic medicine in the logic of Ayurveda, we should be able to call it. But this would be a very dangerous proposition to make today, because people are waiting to get some reason to practice allopathy. But it's only a question of principle. So we do have this problem. We'll try to see how this can be tackled. And I'm sure some of the presentations that were given today, we consider that this is given us some basic inputs, to start thinking in this way. How do we create a logical framework in the background of which we will be able to clearly define, what is the treatment protocol in Ayurveda? How can we call it as a classical treatment protocol? Now, when we look at outcome measures, again, this was a big problem which we faced in our NIH study. We were evaluating the patient's improvement in terms of the ACR criteria, but we couldn't do so in terms of Ayurvedic criteria. We did create some crude forms, and they're so crude that it isn't worth even showing it now. And we learned a lot of, realized that we made a lot of mistakes in making these forms. And that is why when I was talking to Dr. Kamath, I think once, I was just saying that, validation is quite a challenge here. Clinically validating a form, that it should be clinically, working. Unless you do, you cannot create forms again theoretically. I mean, it needs to be tested on patients, and you need to check it for internal and external consistency. And when we have a tool like that, we would be able to really evaluate outcome measures based on Ayurvedic parameters. Unless we have this, we wouldn't be able to bring an Ayurvedic diagnosis onto a research platform. So we need to know, how do we distinguish between Samata and Niramata? Now, some of the US physicians who worked with us wanted to know, they were quite open, I'll come to that. They wanted to know whether we could explain the logic behind changing our treatments, our medicines. So, if they can consistently see that we change a medicine when the body's condition changes from Sama to Nirama, and if that can be shown in an observable manner, they are not asking for tests, they are only asking for clinical evaluations. We could even later, as Dr. Kamath was pointing out, even the ACR criteria earlier was only clinical. It was much later that they brought in other parameters. So it is not even necessary, but can we prove clinically that we are able to clearly distinguish between samata, niramata, and based on those judgments we are making corresponding changes in the medications. Now doshatikya, why do you choose? The Dr. Jackson sir was also pointing out some of the variables on the basis of which we change medicines. Now can this be objectified? Could this be kind of demonstrated on the basis of actual clinical observations? If we can do that, then we go a very big step forward in research communication. The avastha visheshas like uttana, gambhira avastha, again we tried to develop questionnaires and scores, but they were not clinically that sound, so it didn't yield any useful results. It does produce some scores, but we are not finding that it is correlating clinically in a meaningful way. But we are going to hold some other workshops later to take up such materials and see if we can kind of improvise it. Now what are the Roga Vimukti Lakshanas? Some of the forms in Ayurveda, like are very, very similar to the HAC, the quality of life assessments and certain other things can also be developed. So these are the challenges before us. I was just trying to summarize through these slides. These are some of the areas. If we want to bring in a research perspective into Ayurveda, we need to be very seriously thinking about these things in terms of the diagnosis, in terms of the treatment protocol, and in terms of the outcome measures that we are going to use when we do research. Now, I think before we think of communicating with allopathic physicians, what is really very important is to have an Ayurvedic approach to classify this group of diseases. And our specialty also comes as rheumatology. And once again, we do not know whether rheumatology can have a exact equivalent in Ayurveda. But we need to create a category, because it is, for us, one samprapti leads to so many diseases. And what is a disease category seems to be something which we must finalize, as that is the approach of our acharyas like Vagbhada and Charaka. I mean, they were not looking at specific disease entities, but they were looking at an entire disease process which could have varying clinical presentations, but there will be one underlying logic behind the treatment which unites all these diseases together. In fact, in Ayurveda, I think the diagnosis is most often the discovery of the Chikitsa Sutra, rather than what is wrong. It is not a pathological diagnosis. It is actually a therapeutic diagnosis. Because in Ayurveda, we are more interested in knowing not what has gone wrong inside the body, but what is the body's response to that pathology. Because a treatment is a facilitation of the healing process. Because in Jwara, we say Pajana is necessary, is because we see that the body is trying to do Pajana, which is why the Chikitsa Sutra. So we say don't do Shodhana, don't do Vamana. Why? Because there is no Utklesha. Body is trying to burn the doshas, so help it in burning the doshas. So that is why we don't have a pathological classification of diseases. This is one reason why I think allopathic diagnosis and Ayurvedic diagnosis will never match. Because allopathic diagnosis maps you and tells you what is exactly gone wrong. So the same wrong might have happened in 5 individuals. But Ayurveda is not interested in that part of pathology, but it is looking at what is the variation in response of the individual to these pathologies. So it may be the same pathology. So there were many doctors who asked us, how can there be 2 Vadaraktas or 2 rheumatoid arthritis? There is only one rheumatoid arthritis. I think our answer is that it is true that there is only one rheumatoid arthritis, but it is happening in 5 different patients, and their response to this pathology would be varied. And Ayurveda looks at what is the variation in the response. So our approach to diagnosis needs to be very clearly, because our diagnosis has no value unless it comes out with the Chikitsa Sutra. Which is why in Nidana Sthana and Chikitsa Sthana you find it linked. Charakas, all Nidana Sthanas end with the Chikitsa Sutra only. It doesn't end with a diagnosis. This is a very important way of looking at a disease. Charaka's 8 adhyayas, there are many reasons why only 8 adhyayas are there. And you can find in all the Nidana Sthana adhyayas, he has ended with a Chikitsa Sutra. The end of a diagnosis is Chikitsa Sutra. So there we find in Ayurveda it's very difficult to differentiate between a diagnosis and a treatment protocol. I think this is because our approach here is very, very different. So I think unless we come up with this in a very, and I think Ayurveda, it is possible for us to speak logically about this. If we don't do that, I think we will not be able to communicate. And I don't think we need a very sophisticated language also, because we are using the language of the body itself. It's the body communicating to us, and we have just used a very simple language to transfer this in the way human beings can understand. So I think if we attempt, it would be possible to create a very simple language to communicate what is actually happening inside the body. Now I'll just give a very quick overview of the I'm afraid that this is a very busy slide. I couldn't reduce it to be big enough to read, and I don't think you need to read it. It's not possible in this course of this discussion to read everything. But these are some of the research items that pop up when you do a PubMed search or a Google search. This is from the PubMed. So you can find that this particular paper mentions that a lot of people are actually, it's just a health-seeking behavior report. It shows that a lot of people in India, it's done from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, are actually seeking Ayurvedic physicians for relief from rheumatoid arthritis. Which means that a lot of patients in the country are actually accessing alternative medical care for treatment. Now it's interesting as we go forward to see what kind of evidence has been, and you find one of the top items that come is curcumin. It's called as the Indian solid gold, and we find it is very often related to or correlated to rheumatoid arthritis also. But if you look at actual Ayurvedic practice, I don't think any Ayurvedic physician is pouring turmeric powder into the mouths of patients who are suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. It's definitely not a prominent medicine. So this is where I feel there is a big gap between research and practice in Ayurveda. It is not what is being practiced that is being researched. So I've always been amused. I look at this as the story of Birbal and Akbar. I've been telling this so many times, so many places, so I'm also feeling a bit bored with this story, but probably many of you are new here. It's the story of Birbal, who was surprised to see somebody looking under a street light. In those days, I think they had those, they would burn. There was those traditional street lamps. Somebody was searching for something very fervently, and Birbal came. He looked at him for a long time, and this fellow is continuously searching for a long period. Birbal was curious, and he asked him, "What are you searching for?" So he said, "I have lost my ring and looking for it." I'm sure you must have heard this story. And then Birbal asked him, "Are you sure that you lost it here?" No, I lost it in a place which was very dark, but since I cannot see anything there, I am looking under this lamp. If you look at Ayurveda, the research in Ayurveda, it is very much like this person searching for the ring under the light. Because it's easy to do this kind of research. People are doing all kinds of research in the name of Ayurveda because it is easy for such research to get approved by a committee. It's easy because the research methodology is simpler. But what has happened, the whole Ayurveda is lost in darkness. The actual practice, what is happening in the patients never comes into the research picture. That is what this Google PubMed search is showing us. So curcumin here, and it says because curcumin has been established to have anti-inflammatory activity, it seems to be interfering with even the pathway which leads to malignancy. So this scientist Bharat Agarwal had also visited our institute once, and he explained, he was very excited about, he said because Indians are using a lot of turmeric. They even say now that Alzheimer's disease incidence is less in India. One of the reasons is because we are using a lot of turmeric. I don't know. Even cancer, he was telling that, I think I remember the slides which he showed, that in US, the incidence of cancer, although in numbers it is more in India, in terms of percentage is much higher in the US. And they seriously think that is because we use a lot of turmeric in our diet, that we have a kind of lesser incidence. I don't know how far it is true, but it's, curcumin has become the thing. So we find curcumin associated with rheumatoid arthritis, and then as I said, we have this semicarpus anacardium. So what is interesting is they have looked at different mechanisms. Like one is the anti-inflammatory mechanism, and then the immunomodulatory. So they have even postulated theories on how these drugs could possibly be working, and we find parallels in modern medicine also. So here again, the whole logic seems to be, see what type of drugs are used in modern medicine and see if we have parallels in Ayurveda. But there is no attempt to see what the physicians are actually doing. So we don't find any research work that tries to study what actually clinicians are using it. The first paper told you that a lot of people are going to Ayurvedic physicians. That was a very interesting study. But you would then expect a series of articles which actually try to analyze and understand what these physicians are doing. But then you find it goes into the lab, and suddenly you find all kind of weird substances which are not at all prominently used being researched, and a lot of money being spent on it. And most of them produce good results, which is a very, very surprising thing. If you look at all the research papers that even come to our journal, the results are very good. But no medicine is coming out of it into the market, or people are. I was surprised when we get infections, overwhelming infections. We still, sometimes even I agree, I have to use antibiotics. But if you look at some of our past issues, you would really wonder whether you need antibiotics, because all the herbs have been proven to have antimicrobial or antiviral activity. But none of them is actually working in the clinical practice. We have not been able to make a medicine out of it. So I wanted to give an attention to the fact that unless we come into the scenario of clinical practice, unless we work with physicians who are actually treating patients, Ayurvedic research will not advance. We will come up with, scattered, half-cooked studies like this. And these matter because PubMed, that becomes the authority for what is research. And any scientist looking worldwide, so I'll come to that interesting paper also. So we have complementary and alternative therapy in arthritis. So many of these studies have been conducted in India. This is again, utilization of CAMP is a universal phenomenon. So we have papers, one which is saying that physicians are using it, but the other which does laboratory studies and doesn't really look at what physicians are using. So we have, there another pathway which people have looked at. One is antioxidant, then we have immunomodulatory, and we also had anti-inflammatory. So they have looked at three pathways in terms of what modern medicine understands. So many antioxidants have also been looked at. So I don't need to explain this. If you just go to PubMed and type Ayurveda, rheumatoid arthritis, all these papers will come up. Now again, semicarpus anacardium. This is coming again and again as an important drug which has been tried and tested in rheumatoid arthritis, and they have even tried to understand how this mechanism, how this drug possibly could be working in rheumatoid arthritis. Now, there are some other studies also that have been done. There's one Dr. Arvind Chopra. he's based in Pune. He has come into a lot of prominence now in the field of rheumatology. He has been involved through the Nimitli project, the New Millennium Initiative for Traditional Indian, that is, by R.A. Mashelkar. After the turmeric debate, he initiated a new movement in which he was attempting to create a traditional knowledge digital library making available traditional knowledge to the patent offices. That also raised a lot of controversy. But through the Nimitli project, a lot of Ayurvedic drugs have been evaluated, out of which Arvind Chopra has become a prominent rheumatologist who has done a lot of studies. So you find some of his, but he's again worked on individual formulations, not again looked at the clinical practice. We don't find a single study which actually looks at the actual clinical practice in Ayurveda. So this is one of his papers, Rheumatology Made in India, where he gives a lot of emphasis on what Ayurveda can offer, and he is quite convinced. That's also interesting. Now he has, in spite of having used single formulations, he clearly says that we only need to explain how it works. He has seen that these medicines really work in actual clinical practice. Then we have this double-blind randomized controlled trial of Shallaki. This is what I was told. Another herb called Boswellia serrata. This is also a bit surprising. If you look at the market of drugs for rheumatoid arthritis in Europe, it is Boswellia serrata, Shallaki, which is very prominent. And it has no bearing with the research. If you look at the research material, you would have expected curcumin or Semicarpus anacardium to come in, but it is not that. It is a herb like Shallaki which is prominent. So again, there is some serious problem of improper dissemination of the research information. It is not leading to any meaningful decision making. And finally, this is the last thing, the conclusion of research. There's what is called as a systematic review. So some scientists, they name Park and Ernst E. they also came to the CCRAs gave them a lot of material on what research has already happened. It's a shame that we don't have a good database to even show to people when they want to do a systematic review. So CCRAs gave all these papers and they concluded that there is a paucity of RCT. There is no meaningful data available to show that Ayurveda can do anything for rheumatoid arthritis. So ultimately all this research has ended up in this conclusion. And our CCRAs has also contributed to such a decision making. So, this is, if you look at the overall scenario, this is, what we see. Now, before I come into the presentation, time is flying very fast. But the presentation actually won't take much time. It's the preparation that is taking all the time. I just need to briefly go through some of the criteria that we use, because I want to tell you now that we did a study. It happened, very providentially. And it is also a big lesson for us in perseverance, because we would like to say that, this is an attempt that started way back in the 70s when our MD Krishna Kumarji was, trying to do something for Ayurveda. He went to the WHO and got a project. And I think many of you are aware that didn't come out with good results for the wrong reasons, which is why I began to believe that truth will take time to triumph. And for us, it is a real experience, because 25 years after that study was done, and actually Krishna Kumarji was mentioning my name in the morning, but I think the credit should go to a scientist from University of Washington. When she visited our institute, Dr. Manohar, she accidentally, or I think somehow she looked at, or maybe Krishna Kumarji had told her to have a look at these documents. The only thing that we did was that study was prematurely concluded. ICMR didn't come out with any proper analysis. They said it is not worth studying, but the results were all there. It is still preserved. And so this lady took up all these results and did try to do an analysis. In fact, one Dr. Radhakrishnan, the director of the Indian Statistical Institute, he's a very reputed statistician. His analysis was also there, which actually showed that the patients had improved. So we could not understand why the study was dumped, because of course those parameters were not up to date. I mean, they are in the 70s, they don't match with the present criteria. But there was definitely improvement, and that paper is now going to get published. I mean, it has been kind of reworked, and after kind of some formatting, we're planning to get it published, just to show that there was a study. It didn't really get published. And ICMR has been mentioning in many reports that, the Ayurvedic ICMR WHO study proved that there's no Ayurvedic medicine which even can do better than aspirin. But the results showed something different. But 25 years later, this data was dug up, and this provided the basis for getting a grant from the NIH. It is very difficult to approach the National Institutes of Health without some preliminary data. And it was this WHO study data which actually gave us the best score. Our grant got the best score, and the new study came into being. And I'm happy to say, that is what I would like to say. Dr. Daniel First, who was a clinical lead investigator, has given permission to share some data, but not everything. But some important slides also he has allowed to share, but he with the condition that it shouldn't be distributed or it shouldn't be copied or photographed, because there are stringent rules in research publication. And unless the publication is done, you are not allowed to share the actual data. But we can discuss a lot of things about the outcomes, which would still give a lot of insight on what happened during the study. I'm also happy to say that we are planning the next phase of this study, and Department of Ayush has in principle agreed to invite Dr. First in May. We want to repeat this study on a larger scale, including about 8 to 10 centers. We're still debating on, the real challenge is to have physicians who will think in the same way. If we straight away identify 8 to 10 centers in India, it might even spell disaster, because the approaches would be entirely different. So we're thinking of a way in which, people who belong to the same school of thought, using which logic we did that previous study. And I must say it was entirely the call was by Dr. K.G. Ravindran. He was a physician who actually treated all these patients. He was given the freedom to diagnose every patient in his own way and decide whatever treatment he wanted to give. There was no interference. And at the end of the day, we used ACR criteria to analyze whether the patients improve. So because we did not have a standard Ayurvedic diagnosis, we used rheumatoid arthritis as a criteria for entry of the patients. And here again, Dr. First was very supportive. He said that we shouldn't take very advanced cases, so we used cases which were, relatively fresh but with active RA, not dormant. They were really suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. Now, it is hoped that, the Department of Ayush, Dr. First is going to come and make a presentation of, the results of the study in the last week of May. And with this permission, we already made some presentations which got them also interested in supporting this. So this would be another important outcome. We hope that we will be able to kind of make an inroad into research into rheumatoid arthritis, and I'll explain these things. But I would like to point out that when we looked at outcome measures, these are some of the tools that we used. These are all very well defined by the American College of Rheumatology. I wouldn't say they're still final, because in modern medicine you keep refining these criteria, but what we have today is kind of globally accepted. And Dr. Daniel First is also one of the scientists. He's a master of the American College of Rheumatology. You need to have made very significant contributions in the field of rheumatology to be elected as master of the American College of Rheumatology. He's one of those few scientists, so his reputation is very high. Now it's very important also that when we have a communication with the allopathy community, we must get people who are really authoritative there, who are at the top level, because once they get convinced, it's very easy to kind of make a communication at the other levels. So I'll briefly go through these kind of tools that we used. What is interesting here is that they have a very clear-cut logical protocol for many things, like right from diagnosis, from deciding the severity of the disease, the stage of progress of the disease, how to, what safety measures you should do when you put a patient on a rheumatoid arthritis clinical trial, what is the logic for, deciding a treatment protocol. Now I'm just showing this to mention that if we want to bring Ayurveda also onto a research platform, we must have something. It may not be a mimicking of what they have done. I'm not intending that at all. But as far as communication is concerned, we must have a logical structure and a framework which will be clinically consistent, and on the basis of which Ayurvedic physicians can engage in a sambhasha. And all CME programs and our attempt is to be able to make physicians talk to each other. And unfortunately, that is what is not happening in the field of Ayurveda. So I think we are only following Charaka's dictum, Bhishajasaha Sambhasheda. So he says you must speak. And if we want to speak, we must have a language and a framework which makes sense clinically, not just theoretically. So, just quickly go through this. There are a lot of, this is the criteria. They say early, moderate, severe, terminal. We did some preliminary studies to compare and see whether some of these classifications, match with our Uttana Gambhira classification. We found that Sushruta and Charaka have slightly different opinions. One of them saying that Uttana is only a later stage of, it's an early stage, and Gambhira is something which happens later, but Charaka wants to look at them as different entities. So it is because clinically sometimes a patient can present with Gambhira Avastha without, it is not Uttana Purvaka. So we came up with a classification as Uttana Purvaka Gambhira or direct Gambhira or Uttana Avastha. And today we have also ideas that different joints may be in different stages of progression. Now these are very important clinically, and unless we come up with some objective criteria to map this in a meaningful way, we will not be able to talk to each other in a meaningful sense. Like if one physician we have to reach a stage where there is an agreement between two physicians that this is early Uttana stage, or this is a Uttana Purvaka Gambhira, or it is a direct kind of. So unless we are able to do that, I don't think we will make much headway in research. Right, so these are the various other criterias, and what we really used is this American College of Rheumatology response criteria. Now this tries to understand whether after your treatment the patient improves. Either is there a 20% improvement, or is there a 50% improvement, or a 70% improvement. This is a complicated, not complicated, but a well calculated methodology which includes both laboratory, clinical, as well as patient subjective assessment. All these are combined together to create the ACR response criteria. And I have a slide which Dr. First has allowed to share, which looks at the patients in terms of ACR 20, 50 and 70, at the week 24 and at week 36. And there are some interesting findings which I would like to share. So these are the protocols that we use. So we have to say that although we tried to experiment in Ayurveda, I'm just skipping through those slides. Although we tried to experiment with Ayurvedic parameters, we didn't make much headway. And we are hoping that we'll be able to do it now because we are in a better understanding of where we went wrong and how we should approach. So we used only allopathic criteria. So this was a study in which patients would be diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis based on ACR criteria by an allopathic physician, and then they would be enrolled into the study. They would come to an Ayurvedic physician, and Dr. Ravindran was involved. He did not have to give any Ayurvedic diagnosis. He did not have to even think whether it is rheumatoid arthritis. This is one condition that we wanted to be fulfilled, without which we were not willing to enter into the study. So there was some debate before the study was designed, and here we must really appreciate Dr. First's openness, because he was willing to. This was something which we could not convince many of our scientists in India, that Ayurveda should be, he made radical changes in the RCT design, which I think is very phenomenal, because somebody of his standing, if some ordinary scientist does it, it is different. But somebody who is a master of ACR and a very well-reputed scientist will not tinker with the RCT design, unless, because it would be kind of blasphemy in the scientific field. But he did that, and we'll get into those details. Now, before that, I would like to say that we also need to develop a clear perspective of clinical evidence. So this is where I would like to distinguish between the practitioner's approach and the researcher's approach. I am quite convinced that in Ayurveda, we have really emphasized the need for a research approach to clinical practice. Like, majority of our practitioners may not need it. I also feel that we needn't complicate things. At least at a BMS education level, what is required is make physicians capable of understanding diseases in Ayurvedic way and giving the treatments. Let us not make it too complicated by bringing all these things. At a basic level, that is what is necessary. But at another level, we definitely need to. So Charaka, he says that there is skepticism. It is very interesting to note that Charaka and Vagbada has accepted that there will always be skepticism. Ayurveda is a knowledge system, and as long as it's a knowledge system, skepticism has to be accepted. If it was a blind belief system, then it is different. Because when Agnivesha himself questions Atreya by saying that I don't believe what you said, I am not convinced that your treatment is really working. And then Charaka has clearly said that when you treat a patient, if the patient improves, you have to really think whether it was due to chance effect or it was really due to your medicine. So he was the first scientist in the world to distinguish, bring the concept of statistics into evaluating clinical outcomes. When he said Yadricha Siddhi. In modern statistical terms, Yadricha Siddhi means chance. This is what a statistician attempts to do. All that a statistician is doing, although his calculations look complex, he is only trying to see whether the outcome could have been due to chance or it was really due to the intervention. So this foundational approach to statistics is very clear in Charaka Samhita. I'm not going into a lot of details, but I found that there is a very clear research perspective in our tradition. If Ayurveda is a knowledge system, then that's my phone. If Ayurveda is a knowledge system, I'm sure we can also develop our own approach to research. And I think unless we do that, we will not be able to have a meaningful dialogue with modern research scientists. So Ayurveda has clearly described natural course of diseases. It was one of the earliest systems which understood that diseases can get cured without any medical intervention. And a physician is a fool if he thinks that always it is he who cures the disease. So he uses the term Vina Bheshaja Sadhya. Vina bhi Bheshaja Sadhya. There are many diseases which actually get cured, they are self-limiting. In fact, most allopathic practitioners dismiss Ayurvedic successes. The three reasons they give is either self-limiting, or it was a placebo effect, or it was a spontaneous remission. But I have found that all these three phenomena have been very clearly described in Ayurvedic text. Self-limiting diseases were known to them, placebo effect was also known to them, and spontaneous remission was also known to them. Charaka very clearly says that there are certain serious diseases which can all of a sudden resolve, because there is a constant tug of war between Nidana, Dosha, Dushya. Visheshebhyo, Vikhara, Vikhada, Bhava, Bhava, Vishesha. That is a context where spontaneous remission is clearly mentioned. The disease can unexpectedly get cured. The disease can, it is not a self-limiting disease. It is not a self-limiting disease. Self-limiting disease, Vinavi Beshajya. Here, what Ayurveda has understood was, in diseases like cancer, even rheumatoid arthritis, a remission can happen not just because of the treatment. Because the body has already been trying to balance it, all of a sudden a spontaneous remission can happen. And Charaka says, Manasu Arthanukulyadhi Tushtirurja Balodaya Vyadhes Chapi Balakshaya. So just when you influence the mind, the disease, there will be a general sense of well-being. This also has been explained by Charaka. So it is not that they did not understand what is a placebo. In fact, Charaka clearly says that you must always rule out spontaneous remission, placebo effect, and make sure that it was a real siddhi and not a yadrcha siddhi. And now, it's also interesting to find, if you look at our Anumana Pramanas, you find the statistical concepts are very clearly there. If you want to establish a causal relationship, so research actually tries to establish a cause and effect relationship between two events.